Case, it is my honor and pleasure to welcome our esteemed guests from such a well-respected company, which is Chevron Phillips Chemical, and we have today the President and COO, Mr. B.J. Hebert.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Wow, this is a pretty packed house. This is outstanding. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Chevron Phillips Chemical, our thoughts on forward growth, where we are in the world, industry drivers. But the most important thing is I brought something special. But I'm going to save it for last. In this bag is one of the greatest innovations that ever happened for mankind. But I'm going to save that. So that's a tease, by the way. And it is a Chevron Phillips Chemical bag. So, here we go. They told me I could not mess this up because the green button's so big I can't miss it. So let's see. Oh, it doesn't show up here, it shows up there. There we go. Okay. So I'll talk about the industry, I'll talk about where we are, how we see the world unfolding, because it's been, as Steve was saying, an incredible 18 months, right? And the best thing is be able to talk to everybody, face to face in a room like this so we can network and really get to know one each other, because that's how we do business, right? This is how we do business. So I'll walk through this. I have a little bit of time for questions at the end, and hopefully this will be helpful. So just a little bit of background on Chevron Phillips Chemical. We were formed about 20 years ago in 2000. So it's when the chemical assets of Chevron and the chemical assets of Phillips 66 came together to form Chevron Phillips Chemical. And over that 20 years, it's been an incredible amount of growth. So we started from a company with just a few $1 billion worth of assets to a company with over $17 billion worth of assets today, over $8 to $9 billion of revenue, 5,000 employees, assets all over the world. We got assets in, of course, U.S. Gulf Coast, assets in the Middle East, assets in Europe, and assets in Asia. Okay, so a tremendous growth story. Have strategic partners in the Middle East, both in Saudi Arabia and Qatar. So a tremendous growth story, great culture, great company, and we're really poised, I think, and well positioned to take advantage of the demand that's coming. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So when we think about in the last 18 months, I started with Chevron. I've only been with Chevron Phillips Chemical since November of last year. I was with OxyChem for 30 plus years before then. So I've been in the chemical industry my whole career. Well, when COVID hit, it was one of those seminal events, right? And so everything happens, demand stops, the world basically slows down and stops. And so you're sitting there thinking about what's going to happen, right? And when you're running a large corporation, the first thing you do, you hunker down, you reduce costs, you get really efficient, and you start thinking about, okay, how can we work through this? But then an amazing thing happened, that for companies in the plastic space like us, we immediately saw demand recover. And the first event that we saw, or first sign that we saw with demand was, personal hygiene, things associated, Clorox, wipes, plastics, syringe, all of those things, that demand immediately took off, right? Because personal hygiene became extremely important with COVID. So we saw, demand return much quicker than we thought, and it was good. And then when the vaccines came, and when the vaccines, were very effective, and people started getting vaccinated, and economy started to open back up on a global basis, we saw an unbelievable increase in demand. And that was driven by a lot of factors, right? Number one, one of the things we track is the savings rate in the United States. And I've looked at it for years and years. And I'm talking about personal savings, what everyone in this room puts away every month. On average in the U.S., that's been about 5% for the last 30 years. That went from 5% to a peak of 33% in June of 2020. And then it's come down, but it's still in that 15 to 13% range. So think about that. Incredible change. So that means most folks out there, bank accounts are higher than it was at the beginning of COVID. Now, that's not for everybody, right? Because restaurants, other places were hit much harder. But for most everyone, they maintained their job. They did the same thing industry did. They hunkered down. They didn't spend any money. Couldn't go anywhere, right? Couldn't go to a restaurant. Couldn't go on vacation. All that money piled up in their bank accounts. So that's step one. Step two, governments across the world pumped an incredible amount of stimulus in the economy, right? That added stimulus. And so once the vaccines came and people started going out, going on vacation, expanding their houses, that demand hit like a tidal wave across our industry and most industries. Matter of fact, so much so, there's no inventory out there, right? If you try to buy anything to do with recreation, ATVs, boats, jet skis, you name it, can't find them. Can't get it. I'm trying to buy a side-by-side for my 94-year-old father who can't understand why I don't have it to him yet. And I said, Dad, look, I ordered it. It's in August. They're telling me November, and he just, he thinks I'm just being slow. I was like, no, Dad, I'm going to get it. I promise. I'm going to get it. But the world's short, and so the inventories are low, and a lot of that's due to chips and other things. But the core point I want to leave with you is demand snapped back incredibly strong, and that shows in that graph. So global GDP for 2021 is expected to be about 5.6%, which is a huge number. Now, we're starting to see with Delta, we're starting to see demand slow down a little bit. You're having an impact because of Delta, not only in the U.S., but in other countries. But still, overall, we're pretty optimistic about global demand. So I'll talk about, these are the core drivers that we look at, of course, growth in plastics demand, and then certain project drivers, inflation, steel, labor, that sort of thing. And then I'm going to talk about sustainability, and I'm going to talk about ESG, because that's top of mind for every corporation out there. So we'll dive right into it. So first off with plastics. From a macro level, here's the main thing you got to know. If global populations are growing, the demand for plastics is going up, period, full stop, right? So as long as there are more people on the planet and the population will continue to grow, the demand's going to be there. Now, when you look at the next layer, specifically the middle class is the biggest driver of demand. So if you just look at middle class growth from 2020 to 2040, our estimates is going to add about 350 million people are going to enter the middle class. So 350 million people, what does that mean? What's the population of the United States? About that. It's about 335 million. So a population the size of the United States is going to enter middle class in the next 20 years. That's a huge tailwind for demand, right? So we feel good. We feel good about the demand. We think the long-term fundamentals. Our core business model in the petrochemical space is we locate and have our assets where you can have the lowest cost feedstocks, right? Which is why, and I'll talk about our positioning a little bit later on, but of course we're positioned in U.S. Gulf Coast and we're positioned in the Middle East, and we have prominent positions in both. But that's because that's where the lowest feedstock costs are, right? And so if that growth is coming, excuse me, and if you have a tailwind and you're located in the lowest cost regions, you're well positioned. And even though business goes through cycles, you should be able to go through any cycle. So we're optimistic. So the demand's going to be there. There we go. So we're in the polyethylene business. That's our core driver. So a little bit of data on specifically on polyethylene. When we look at polyethylene, historically it's grown at 4% like clockwork for the last 20 years, which is above GDP. We expect that to continue, that it's going to be kind of a GDP plus type growth rate across the globe. So even though you have an investment cycle kind of runs 7 to 10 years, COVID's kind of thrown that cycle out of whack, but it always happens. But again, the core is if populations are growing and people are entering the middle class, the demand's going to be there. So if you're located in the U.S. Gulf Coast and the Middle East, we think you have an advantage, and we think we have an advantage. So feel good about polyethylene demand going forward. So, and this is a little bit more about that geographic strategy. What that shows is, the cash cost to produce ethylene, which is the core of polyethylene, how that relates in, United States, Asia, Western Europe, other countries. the USA is the lowest bar. It shows 2000. The bars are 2015, 2020, and 2025. And the line across there is Saudi Arabia or the Middle East. It's a representative of the Middle East at $1.75 MMBTU. Okay, so the Middle East has the lowest cost in the world, followed by the U.S., and then everybody else's region is higher, which gives us an arbitrage opportunity, right? We can take low-priced feedstocks, ethanes, propanes, and butanes, make value-added product like the plastics that we make, and be able to ship those to the world and be competitive and make a profit. And being located in those two regions are the key for us. So I've showed you the population is growing. I've showed you the middle class is growing. That should drive demand. So if I really believe that, we ought to be looking at growth, right? Well, we are, right? We're looking at two very large projects right now. One called U.S. Gulf Coast 2, which we're looking at orange. And the other one is Ras Laffan Petrochemical Project in Qatar. Both huge world-scale ethylene, polyethylene type facilities to meet this growing demand. Now, I think some of you know who follow the industry. We've delayed the FID for U.S. Gulf Coast 2 in response to COVID because we were moving full steam ahead on both projects. And so once COVID hit, we tapped the brakes a little bit to be able to assess the markets. And so we have final FID for that project, hopefully in the first quarter of 2022, similar time frame for RLPP. And so we're still looking at it, still assessing, but again, those macro fundamentals that I showed, we think are in place. So I feel pretty positive about it. But final decision will be made. We want to be thoughtful, want to be careful. These are, multi-billion-dollar investments, and so you want to be sure, right? You want to be confident about your belief of the fundamentals. But we're looking at it. We're looking at growth. And like I showed in that first slide, there's been a history of 20 years of growth with CP Chem, and I'm sure we're going to continue to grow. So the other thing that a lot of people don't realize with CP Chem, of course, big ethylene, polyethylene, alpha olefins producer, but we also make this product called 1-hexene, which is an additive that goes into polyethylene processing that makes the plastic softer, more flexible, and stronger. And so really what it does, a simple way to think about it, is it makes the product stronger but less dense at the same time. So it's lighter and stronger, right? So we have proprietary technology of 1-hexene. We're one of the leading producers in the world. We've announced another world-scale expansion of that at our Sweeney plant. You can see the numbers, 600 construction jobs and another 50 full-time people. But this is a real important business for us, a very profitable business, and some of those really innovative plastic products can't exist without 1-hexene. So that's another part of our growth strategy as we go forward. So project drivers, let's talk about that for a minute. Inflation. Everybody's experienced inflation right now. You name it, the price is up. I was in California last week. Gas is $5, right? It's $5, right? We won't talk about their politics while we're in Texas, but it's $5. But inflation is everywhere. When you look at building a big project, multi-billion-dollar project, like I was just talking about, cost of steel is really important. Cost of labor is really important. Steel's up 36% year to date, right? Labor, I have a bullet on there about public policy influence. I'm going to give you a real world example. So we all know what's happening in Washington, D.C. We've all seen I talked about the government stimulus. We've all seen the unemployment benefits have been extended, eviction moratoriums, all those kind of things. I don't want to get into the politics. I'm just going to tell you what the real world impact of that is. We have a very large polyethylene pipe company called Performance Pipe. And we got facilities all over the U.S. Well, we had one in Reno, Nevada, and we did a job fair because we're running short on people, can't find people. Did a job fair in Reno, Nevada, working for Chevron Phillips Chemical, great dollar per hour, full benefits, 401k, just like all the companies here offered. You know how many people showed up? 0. None. Nobody showed up. We were stunned. So we did some sensing, and we went out in the community and started talking, and the answer we overwhelmingly got was, human beings will make a conscious decision. If they can sit at home and get free money, they'll sit at home and get free money. That's the fact, right? So we had to reevaluate our offer with a new competitor in play being the federal government. It's just a fact. I'm just telling you. I mean, we don't want to get in politics, but that's what happened. So we're readjusting that, but it's caused a distortion in the labor market, right? Everybody's looking for people, especially people with skills, right? So for the students here from Lee College, Lone Star, come see me after. We probably got a job for you, right? But people are looking for the skills. But the actions of the government has created a distortion in the markets that we're all living with, and we have to deal with. But we got to survive, right? We have to figure out a way to make those work. So inflation, labor issues, but project planning. One of the real key skills at CP Chems, we're very good at executing these large projects, and we can do them doing well. We think we have a first mover advantage on those projects. We already have permits in place, which getting a permit today for a large facility like that is not as easy as it used to be. So, but these are considerations that you have to take into account when you look at these large projects. Okay, so let's talk about ESG and sustainability. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And, climate change, sustainability is top of mind for every corporation on the planet right now. And so every corporation is figuring out how they can reduce emissions, how can we make a more sustainable product, how can we make things circular, and how do we really plan for the future. And, everybody's got a different definition of sustainability. I'll give you mine for what it's worth, because I was curious. I'm leading our effort at CP Chem on ESG, but even before that at my former employer, when we really started thinking about this, I started thinking about what does sustainability really mean? And so I kind of did, being an engineer, I kind of did my own little analysis, said, okay, well, if I made an assumption that it would be a good thing that if we could raise the standard of living of everyone in the world to the U.S. standard of living, that'd be a good thing, right? Makes sense. So I thought that'd be a good thing. So what I did was I said, okay, I looked at the power consumption per capita, water consumption per capita, and waste generated per capita in the U.S., China, and India. And I calculated the numbers, okay? So in the U.S., like for just water, for example, in the U.S., all of us on average, and this is including all industry and the whole 9 yards, but every person uses about 100 gallons of potable water per day on average in the U.S. And I might have my numbers a little off, but you'll get the message. I think in China it's like 30 gallons, India it's like 27, okay? And why did I pick China and India? Well, those are the two largest population bases, right? You got about 1.4 billion people in each one. So if the U.S. is at 100 gallons, China and India are at, call it 30, and we want to raise them to the same level, there isn't enough fresh water on the planet, right? Did the same thing for power and said, hey, look, for the power consumption we have here in the U.S., we got ACs, we all have computers, we have all these gadgets, our kids are on their phones all the time, it's making them blind, driving them crazy. No, just kidding. Sorry, I digress. But if you assume that same power consumption per capita and you brought China and India up there, there isn't enough resources to generate that power. So, and I did the same thing with waste, and you can imagine waste showed the same story. So in my mind, from a sustainability standpoint, that made sense to me that, hey, look, the world has to change. We have to get more efficient. We can't waste as much, right? For the world, for the population to truly grow and for everybody to raise standard of living. So that made sense to me. So we started looking at Chevron Phillips about really two main things, circularity and how do we lower our emissions, how do we lower our footprint. So for circularity, plastics are an unbelievable, incredible product. However, in certain countries that doesn't have waste management practices in place or don't have that infrastructure, plastics end up in the wrong place, right? They end up they don't end up in the landfill, they'll end up floating out in the ocean, right? Everybody has seen images of plastics and floating debris in the ocean. About 70 to 80% of all that plastic is coming from about 7 to 8 rivers in Asia, okay? And it's coming from a lot of the emerging countries who don't have that infrastructure in place. So how do we drive and make it more circular so you can capture that plastic, make sure you manage it right, or in best case, reuse it, right? Turn it back into the same thing or turn it back into something else that you can use. So that's what circularity is all about. And so we're one of the leaders in advanced recycling. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but just from a simple standpoint, advanced recycling allows you to take plastics and run it through a process using heat, pressure, and solvents that brings it back to its base molecular structure that it can be reused, okay? And I'll go with that in a little bit more detail, but once you can do that, it becomes circular. You can use it over and over and over again, okay? So we've done a lot of work in that space, and I'll talk a little bit about it. So, but we also support mechanical recycling, so we're wanting to do both advanced recycling and mechanical recycling. There's been a lot of effort in recycling in the U.S. There's been a lot of investment, but it's just scratching the surface. A lot more work needs to be done. So talking about lowering our carbon footprint, you know, we want to have a goal, and we're building our goals right now to do not only reduce our emissions intensity, which emissions intensity is how much do you emit per pound of product, right? We don't want to reduce our intensity and reduce our total emissions. Well, how do you do that and grow at the same time, right? That's the hard puzzle. Well, the way we're going to approach it is in our legacy existing facilities, we're going to do everything and use every technology we can to reduce the emissions of those facilities, right? And then for new facilities like U.S. Gulf Coast 2, our Ras Laffan petrochemical project, we want to put in the best technology to ensure that those facilities have the lowest intensity, such that even though in total the emissions may go up because you just built a bigger plant, we want it to be so efficient that when you look at the emission intensity over the entire company, it goes down, not up, right? We get more efficient. We can make more pounds with less emissions. So we're looking at both, reducing our emissions and reducing our emissions intensity across the globe. We're also, you know, we have wonderful owners in both Chevron and Phillips 66. We're partnering with them to look at carbon capture and storage, right? How do you take CO2, capture it, inject it back in the ground, store it forever? Lots of oil and gas companies have been doing that for years. It's called enhanced oil recovery, where you can take CO2, go to an old oil field, inject the CO2 in the ground. That helps bring some of the oil back up that you couldn't capture before. But the interesting thing is a big part of that CO2 stays captured forever, right? That's what carbon capture and sequestration is about. So we're working on that. We're uniquely positioned. We own a lot of pipelines, caverns, because that's the key. You have to be able to capture CO2, get it from point A to point B, get it to formations like in the Permian where you can inject it down hole and sequester it forever. So we're working on that as well. So lots really going on in this space, and I'm sure a lot of the companies in this room are all doing the same thing, something very similar. So just real quick, I talked about, this is kind of our strategy. I talked about product sustainability and circularity, advanced recycling. I'll hit on that again. We talked about climate and how we want to reduce our emissions, and then also how we want to harden our facilities, and I'll talk about that. But the last one that's on here that I want to bring up is the S part, the social engagement, or proactive engagement. And so we're building our strategy there, but CP Chem, and you saw the tagline up there, performance by design, caring by choice. We've been doing this for a long time and have a lot of social programs in place for the communities where we have facilities are, but we're looking beyond that. We are doing now projects in areas where we don't have facilities and never will have one. It's more about how do you find a need in the world where people are suffering and you can help them, especially if you can help them with the products you make, right? And I'm not going to tell you about the projects that we'll unveil those later, but the point I want to leave you with is we're moving beyond just working in the communities where we operate. We're going to want to be able to take our products and help them raise the standard of living in some of the poorest regions of the world where people really need help, okay? We want to move beyond just our communities. So that's what the proactive engagement is. There'll be quite a bit more work coming on that, and maybe next year I'll come and tell you about some of those projects. So just kind of a little roadmap. I've touched on a lot of these, but you know, emissions reductions, energy efficiencies. We're looking at lots of different technologies. We're looking at burners at our crackers that can also burn. They burn natural gas today. Can we put in burners that can burn either natural gas or hydrogen? Right? We're looking at, I talked about circularity. We're looking at renewable energy investments. Gary Piana is here at Plant Manager Cedar Bayou. We're looking at a very large solar farm that potentially could power the majority of Cedar Bayou, right? So we'd like to integrate renewables to power a lot of our facilities to back off our scope 2 emissions, right? So we're looking at that. We've even talked about, can we make enough solar power to then put an electrolysis unit to be able to then use some of that power to make green hydrogen, take that hydrogen, put it into those new burners I was talking about at the furnace, and use that in our ethylene furnaces. So a lot going on in that space. And then lastly, facility resilience. You know, to me, you know, it's pointless to debate climate change. The reality is that the earth is warming, right? And as the earth warms, there's going to be more rain. There's no way around that. We've seen it here in Houston. It's going to happen. We have to harden our facilities and prepare for them. You know, we're not going to pick up a Cedar Bayou and move it, right? You have to harden it. You have to work on that site and understand and do projections that what used to be a 100-year rain may be a 50-year rain now, or a 25-year rain, right? And so we're looking at that and doing our analysis to figure out how do we harden the existing sites that we have and how do we better design the future facilities. Okay, so there's a lot of effort going on there. And I know you can't read all that stuff. Well, I guess actually it shows up pretty good up there. But a couple things. One, I talked about plastic waste. And CP Chem, or Chevron Phillips Chemical, was one of the founding members of an organization called the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. And the Alliance was formed as a brainstorm at ACC, the American Chemistry Council, to basically unite the entire plastic value chain. Now, what do I mean from that? Is we wanted to be able to get an alliance associated all the way starting from the folks who are getting the ethanes and propanes and butanes out of the ground, to the folks like CP Chem who convert it into value-added plastics, to the folks like our customers who turn it into something that can be used, and to all the way to the Procters & Gamble's, the PepsiCo, and the Unilevers of the world who are using the products. And we've done it. So the alliances came into formation in January of 2019 with a goal of raising $1.5 billion to do two things. One, stop the plastics from entering the environment in the areas and help those countries set up good waste management practices. And then two, develop innovative technologies like advanced recycling to help drive a circular economy with plastics. So I'm on the board and the executive committee of the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. I'm also the chair of the membership committee. We have 66 members right now. Started with 19. I think 19 were the original founders. So we have 66 now. We should have 75 by the end of the year. So if anybody out here wants to talk about it, I'm the guy. Come see me. We'll get you in. But it's been an absolute fantastic organization. So we stood up the organization. It's based in Singapore. And we've raised not quite the $1.5 billion, but pretty close to it. COVID really slowed it down, but there's a lot of projects that are in all regions of the world that you're going to start seeing more impact on too. But again, all focused on the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. And David Taylor, who's the CEO of Procter & Gamble, has been the chair of the Alliance to End Plastic Waste for the last 2 years. He's fixing to step down, and Jim Fenderling of Dow is going to become the new chairman. But we have the entire value chain. So we have Procter & Gamble, from folks like CP Chem, Chevron Phillips Chemical, to Procter & Gamble, to Unilever, to PepsiCo, and we're trying to get more. We're trying to get Amazon in. We're trying to get, not really as many as we can, but all the brand names that you know, we're trying to get into the alliance. A lot of work there. Operation Clean Sweep Blue, what that is when you make polyethylene, in our polyethylene plants, it makes a little plastic pellet, right? And then plastic pellets, what we'll sell to our customers who will compound it and turn it into pipe and bottles and what have you. All the different products are made. Well, we joined this program to eliminate all emissions of the plastic pellet, to not have any plastic pellet get outside of your fence, right? Which initially, people look at, so plastic pellet's innocuous. What could it possibly hurt? Well, the reality of it is, we're trying to change our culture, and we have changed our culture such that little plastic pellet is the same as a leaking flange or a pinhole leak on a pipe. It's an emission, right? And our goal is zero. Zero. And part of Operation Clean Sweep Blue is we report on how many pellets left our facility or got out into the environment. And so we got a lot of operations, a lot of systems in place to prevent that. We built a sustainability smart toolkit. So we talked about the ESG programs that we're doing at Chevron Phillips Chemical, but one of the initial steps was how do we educate our own employees on what we're doing in sustainability, what does it mean, what is circularity all about, how can we lower our carbon footprint, and it's really been fantastic. They've come up with a Sustainability 101. We got a podcast. It's a group of the folks who are leading that. We do a podcast every 2 weeks where they'll get up and they'll have different folks within the company and have a podcast where they'll talk about what we're doing. But we're developing those communication tools to not only communicate to our employees, but also to communicate to everyone. So you're going to see us do that more externally in the future. Industry goals, we support all the recycling goals with ACC and AFPM are pushing. Circulate Capital Ocean Fund, we've donated quite a bit of money to them. What that is, that's the first, not only anymore, but it was the first investment fund solely directed on developing innovative ways to keep plastics out of the environment in Asia and other places. So we're one of the founding members of that, one of the first people to donate into that. And it's an incubator for different technologies as well. And then community enrichment, I talked about how, we've had a long history of 20 years at CP Chem of working in our communities and helping our communities, but we want to get bigger than that. We want to find the needs in some of the poorest regions in the world and how we can bring and donate our products to make their lives better. So we're doing that. And hopefully next year I'll tell you about the results of some of that. Okay, so with circularity, and I talk about advanced recycling, CP Chem was one of the first that developed what we call Marlex Anew, that when you take plastics and they do it in a pyrolysis technology where I talked about heat, steam, solvents, you can turn any plastic back into its core molecular structure to then be reprocessed through a cracker and turned back into ethylene and then polyethylene into a product again. But here's the beauty. Here's what you got to remember. So everybody understands mechanical recycling, right? Where you can get mechanical, right? You take the plastic, you chop it back up, send it back to the converter, and they put it back into a product. That's mechanical recycling. And mechanical recycling is a good thing, and we support it, and we're trying to grow that as well. Problem with mechanical recycling is it can only go so far, right? Because there are certain things that you can't recycle mechanically. What do I mean by that? Think about healthcare products. Government won't allow you to do that, right? You can't take used syringes, grind them up, and reprocess them into used syringes. You can't do that. You can't do it with food waste. You can't do it with plastic film that's used in the food industry. FDA won't allow it, right? So mechanical recycling can only go so far. That's the beauty of advanced recycling. When you take those plastics and you melt them down in that process and you come out with what they call pyrolysis oil, that's back to its core molecular structure. When I take that material and run it through an ethylene cracker, the ethylene that comes out on the back end is no different than any other ethylene that's ever come out. It's the same. So it can go back into anything. So that's why it's so important. That's why we think that's what has to be really brought to scale to make a real difference on plastic waste, because it's the same. So the customer won't know any different. So we could process pyrolysis oil, make a rail car of Marlex Anew polyethylene. It's the same to the customer. They don't know any different, all right? So bringing that to scale is, in our opinion, is the real answer. And so lots of work on there. You can see our goal. And we're partnered with several companies to help develop that technology and take advantage of that technology. And we think it's critical, very important to be able to drive circularity in plastics. And so just this is just a wheel where I talked about mechanical. You can't completely close the loop with mechanical recycling because you can't do it. You can't turn it back into all the products. Well, theoretically, advanced recycling can do all of that. And you could theoretically recycle it all if you could capture it, right? So you could truly close the loop. So now, we have come to this. One of the greatest innovations for mankind. Y'all ready? Let me pull it out. But here's a hint. It's not the bread. It's the plastic. Why is that? Well, what you see as a plastic bag is really 3 layers of highly engineered plastic designed to do 2 things, right? First thing it's designed for is to extend the shelf life. If I put this bread, so this loaf of bread probably traveled 1,000 miles before it got here, and it's still fresh, ready to use, right? So imagine if I took this bread and I put it in a paper bag, and then I compared that to how long it would last in this plastic bag. What do you think the difference is? Take a guess. 2 weeks? Well, I'll put it on a factor. 10 times as long. 10 times. 10x. Why is that important, right? Why is that critically important? And it's not only a bread bag. You walk to a grocery store, you go to the meat section, and you see the meat with the wrap over it. It's on the polystyrene foam bottom with the wrap over it, and it has a little pad in there. That plastic and polystyrene combination extends the life of that meat from 4 days to 30. Okay. So now that I got your attention on that. I talked about population growing, right? I talked about the middle class, right? So this is critical for 2 reasons. One's really obvious, the other one's not. But I'll give you the obvious one first. So if the middle class is growing by 350 million people over the next 20 years, the global population is going to grow from 7.5 billion people to 9.5 billion people in the next 20 years. Think that's pretty important to feed those people? Absolutely, right? The real message I want to leave you with, when you look at these plastics, next time you go in a grocery store, and every time you see one of these, think about feeding the world. And these are single-use plastics, one of the ones that are being attacked, right? These plastics are being attacked every single day. You eliminate this, people will starve. You can't feed the world. Won't happen. Can't do it. Don't forget that. So, and it's highly engineered. So I talk about 3 layers. There's 3 layers of plastics on this. You buy a box of cereal, the bag that's inside the box, there's 3 plastic liners inside that bag to make the cereal last longer. When you buy the Kraft cheese in the little Ziploc bag, or it's sealed like that, there's 5 layers. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, there's 5 layers. No, let me back up. There's 9 layers on that one. A potato chip bag has 5 layers. That thing of cheese has 9 layers of highly engineered plastic to make sure it lasts. So to feed a growing population, you have to have it. These are innovations. It's not just a plastic bag. Highly engineered to make sure the food lasts and can get to all over the world. So that's the obvious reason. What's the non-obvious reason? Well, here's the non-obvious reason. Unfortunately, even with these innovations, because not all the world, these plastic bags where bread is put together isn't everywhere, right? Some very poor regions don't have this, right? So how much food do you think is wasted every year on a percentage basis? Any guesses? 60? Well, luckily it's not 60. It's 30% though. So 30% of all food grown in the world is never consumed. It's wasted. So one, that's a problem right there in itself, right? That has to be fixed to feed that 9.5 billion people coming, right? So you have to have more of that, right? But here's the other problem with that most people don't know, and I didn't really know it until I started studying or looking into it, is what happens to food when it decomposes? What happens? It gives off greenhouse gases. It gives off natural gas, CO2. All right? So 30% of all food wasted, that's 1.3 billion tons a year. So if you calculate the greenhouse gas equivalent generated by that 1.3 billion tons a year of food that's wasted, that's 3.3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. If food waste was a country, that would be the 3rd largest emitting country. Think about that. So the greenhouse gas, by not using this, emissions go up, not down. You eliminate this, emissions go way up, right? Go way up. So it's absolutely critical. And right now, the way the political climate is, it's so partisan. You know, you have lots of folks out there wanting to eliminate all plastics. Can't happen. Can't happen. We can't let it happen, right? We have to communicate. And one thing the industry's done a really bad job of is communicating stuff like that, the value that our products bring. For years and years, most of my career, you know, we kept our head below the fence, you know, don't make any waves, just run the plant. No. We have to change. We have to educate people about what we're doing, what our products are, and the importance. But there's people out there that want to get rid of it, but they don't understand. They don't get it, okay? We have to educate them. And, you know, when we start talking about, and that's, you know, plastics are all fossil fuel based. Lots of pressure on fossil fuel companies. Normally, you know, both our owners are you know, oil and gas companies. And we're really an oil and gas company because our feedstocks is all fossil fuels, right? And so lots of talk out there about energy transition, lots of talk out there about eliminating fossil fuels. Can't happen, right? We have to adopt an all-the-above energy policy. We have to get better. We have to lower emissions. We have to keep plastic out of the environment. You know, we have to make cars more efficient. All of those things. Have to do all the above, but you can't eliminate fossil fuels. What do you think the other huge use of fossil fuels is that nobody thinks about that ties to the bread in that bag? What do you need to grow food? You need seed, water, soil, sunlight. What else do you need? Fertilizer. Ammonium nitrate. What's the raw feedstock to make ammonium nitrate? Anybody? Natural gas. So for the people who are following the news right now, do y'all see what's going on in both Europe and the UK right now? Well, what's happening is oil and gas companies are their stock price, you know, have shareholders, right? So companies are being pushed to not invest in fossil fuels because you're not getting, normally when a company, you look for two signals, right? You look for supply and demand, where to invest, where you think you can make a return, where you can make a profit, and also what you think the shareholders will reward. What do the shareholders demand? Normally those two things would go hand in hand. Right now they don't. So right now the market's sending an unbelievably, incredibly powerful signal to invest in oil and gas and invest in fossil fuels. But the other signal that CEOs have to look at is the share price. It's sending an entirely different signal. So what do you think happens if those companies can invest into fossil fuels to develop products like this to make sure we have the ammonia? Price goes up. It's exactly what's happening in Europe right now. Europe's about $25 MMBTU for gas right now. In the UK's got an even bigger problem. In the UK, their energy companies, the utility companies that provide power in the UK are all going bankrupt. Why are they going bankrupt? Because natural gas price has shot through the roof and they're on fixed contracts, right? They can't raise that price. UK government's having to step in to keep them from shutting down. The other thing that's happened when I talk about ammonium nitrate, feedstocks, natural gas, the other thing that comes off that process is a pure CO2 stream. That CO2 stream is captured and it's used in fizzy drinks. It's used in all kind of food products. There's an incredible CO2 shortage in UK right now. Government's having to step in to do it. If we don't take that all above philosophy, what we will end up with is higher cost, less choice, and the environment won't be helped. We have to get better. We have to educate folks. They have to understand the value the products are bringing. But with all that said, we're focused on reducing emissions. We have to get better. Have to get better across it. Remember the per capita consumptions I talk about? All our behaviors are going to have to change in order to be able to support 9.5 billion people. I think he's giving me the eyeball. I think I'm going too long. Let me see. All right. There it is. So last slide. So all the way back, we feel good about growth. We feel good about our long-term prospects. Lots of geopolitical headwinds, lots of headwinds on regulations that I just talked about. But at the end of the day, I think people will common sense will prevail, I hope. I think it has to, right? We have to educate, and people have to understand the value that everybody in this room brings to the world, right? But we feel good about our prospects. We feel good about growth. We're committed to ESG. We're committed to being a more sustainable company. We're committed to circularity. We're committed to lowering our carbon footprint. And that's it. Well, thank y'all. Thank y'all.